All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Georgia CTSA Blue Sky Group on addressing threats to lifelong bone health. I want to welcome everybody, and I'll tell you a little bit about what a Blue Sky Group, what the structure is and how we'll proceed today. And I want to thank Joseph Kindler, who is the convener for this group. So Blue Sky Groups were created several years ago in the Department of Medicine to bring together people who haven't worked together before but might have an interest in a common topic. It's a very unstructured discussion. We're not going to be, we'll have a few slides to just set the stage, but we won't be presenting research. We'll be just talking about what's new, what's exciting, and how we might better collaborate. So the way we start is by, I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves and tell us in one sentence about your research and your interest in bone health. And I'm going to start with our convener, who's Joseph Kindler. You might, I guess, also tell us your institution, because that'll be important as we go forward.
Right, yeah, so thanks for the opportunity to speak here today, and nice to meet many of you virtually for the first time. My name is Joe Kindler. I'm an assistant professor in nutritional sciences at the University of Georgia. So I started my position here at UGA last August, and am fortunate to oversee the Nutrition and Skeletal Health Lab here, where we focus on understanding nutrition and disease-related determinants of peak bone mass, peak bone strength, and ultimately lifelong bone health.
Thanks very much. Dan Perrin.
Hi, I'm Dan Perrin. I'm an associate professor in endocrinology at Emory. My lab currently focuses on heterotopic ossification, although I have 20 years of research in things like peak bone mass and bone turnover and osteoporosis as well.
Thanks, Hisham.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Hisham Drisi. I'm a professor of orthopedics and also cell biology. At Emory University. I also am an investigator at the Atlanta VA. My laboratory focuses on two aspects of musculoskeletal diseases. One is orthopedics and multiple aspects of orthopedic research, but also skeletal homeostasis and bone fragility.
Thanks. Luke.
Hi there, I'm Luke Mortensen. I'm an associate professor at the University of Georgia. My lab focuses on, it's a primarily biomedical engineering lab. We do intravital microscopy, optical microscopy, and study bone disease and its effects on collagen, and look at skeletal regeneration, and also at trying to biomanufacture MSC therapeutics for musculoskeletal and inflammatory disorders.
Thanks. Roberto.
Yes, hi, I am a professor at Emory, director of endocrinology. After the years of experience in bone research and bone biology, my main interest is osteoimmunology and microbiome and bone, but I also have expertise in bone densitometry, micro-CT, and human research in osteoporosis. And let me take this opportunity to say that I will have to leave at about 1 o'clock because unfortunately I have a full clinic this afternoon. So I'll try to stretch it a few more minutes, but I can't stay until the very end.
Thanks, Roberto. Jean.
Hi, I'm Gene Roderick. I'm a first-year PhD student at the University of Georgia, and I will be working in Dr. Kindler's lab beginning in January.
Okay, great. Foley, which is a great name, but you might want to rename yourself so we know who you are. Foley, you are still muted if you're trying to talk. All right, we'll come back to that. Joseph?
Hi, I am a postdoc in Dr. Drisi's lab in the Department of Orthopedics at Emory. And I primarily study the role of nutrition on fracture healing. And that's it.
Thanks. Christy.
Hi, I'm with Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. We have an upcoming study with OI patients, so I just wanted some insight and information just logging in for this meeting.
All right, thanks, Jan.
Yeah, I'm a professor in the Department of Pediatrics at Emory. I'm a microbiologist. My main focus is on infectious disease and more recently, last few years, on the microbiome and its impact on organisms that live in the gut.
Thanks, Mindy.
Hi, everybody. I'm just tuning in. I saw the announcement. I'm at Georgia Tech. I run the exercise physiology lab at Georgia Tech, and we don't have a primary research aim right now in bone health, but we've over the years been working with some of our, particularly our distance running athletes, and in our with our DEXA scans. So that's why I just thought I'd tune in. Thanks.
Thank you. Alec?
Hello, my name's Alec Hart. I work with Dr. Mendy at Georgia Tech in the exercise physiology lab. So same with her, just wanted to learn some more information about bone health.
All right, thank you. Dr. Dress? If you're with us, you're muted. No microphone. Can you introduce yourself to us in the chat then? And while we're doing that, John Oshinsky, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. John Oshinsky from Radiology and BME. I do mostly MRI work, but I'm really here as director of the core imaging facility for the School of Medicine. So we have micro CT, QCT, MR, and we'll have some more equipment in HRSB too. So I just sort of want to see what people want and what might be available to people to do bone imaging.
Okay, thanks. So Dr. Dress is from Morehouse and here for curiosity and folate. I don't know if you've gotten back or have microphone access now. Did I miss anybody? I think we have a lot of overlapping interests in basic bone biology, so that's a good thing. I think we'll have some good conversation about this. But just to get the conversation started, I'm going to turn it over to Joe, who had some thoughts about questions that might be of interest to the group.
Right, thank you, Kathy. So it was really nice hearing everybody's background, especially as I did put together a few slides here to go through just to kind of lay a foundation so we all have, I guess, a common vocabulary and kind of just understanding of the background of this idea for this presentation, which is addressing lifelong bone threats to lifelong bone health, as well as, I guess, relevant funding opportunities and requests for applications that are currently out from federal funding sources and non-federal funding sources. So it was really wonderful hearing. I'm glad Kathy brought up the idea of having everybody introduce themselves first. This was really great. Like I mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in nutritional sciences at UGA. So the big picture topic that my lab focuses on is nutritional determinants of peak bone mass and osteoporosis and fracture risk. But we do have interest, I think, in a lot of areas that were brought up: fracture, gut microbiome, gut health. Yeah, so a lot of really wonderful topics came up there. So I think a lot of these will resonate, especially in the realm of bone imaging and relevant resources like John had mentioned. So I will tee myself up here, pull up the presentation, and then share my screen. All right, and you please let me know if you're not able to see me. Kathy, can I get a thumbs up that you can see me okay? Perfect. Thank you guys. Okay, So just a brief guide for today's talk. I will not ramble too long here. I think maybe like 20 minutes or so of just a brief discussion of key topics, focusing on this big picture, topic for today's talk in terms of measurement and threats to lifelong bone health, diving into relevant funding opportunities and priorities that are available from both federal and non-federal funding sources, really hitting on some of the resources and expertise that's currently available through the CTSA. There's a lot of really wonderful minds in this group, so I'm excited to get to meet you all. And we also have really wonderful tools in our tool belts at our respective institutions and our labs. So I'll kind of give a brief rundown of the resources we have available here in the Nutrition and Skeletal Health Lab at UGA. And then I would love to hear about resources down the line so we can figure out ways to synergize and work, I think, as a really impactful team down the line. And then, of course, open up for discussion and determining how best to move forward. So as we're all very well aware, sitting in this virtual room, osteoporosis is a major health concern, especially with an aging population. Musculoskeletal disorders being a leading cause of quote unquote years lived with a disability. The long-term projections by 2025 in terms of osteoporosis being attributed to greater than 3 million fractures, as well as an associated significant hit in the healthcare system in terms of cost, over $25 billion in medical costs by 2025. And again, with respect to the aging population, these long-term consequences that can manifest, especially in some of our older populations. So with some of the very concerning data with respect to mortality, long-term mortality in older adults that fracture, suggesting a high rate of mortality in the subsequent year following hip fracture in particular. Now, much of bone health we're going to think about is it's obviously a moving target across the lifespan. Bone accrual occurs during the childhood, adolescent years. We peak in early adulthood. Then we have our characteristic aging-related declines, some more so than in others, particularly in females with postmenopausal bone loss. However, these childhood and adolescent years are a really critical period in terms of attainment of this theoretical milestone of peak bone mass. So about 90% of adult bone mineral density is accrued during the childhood and adolescent years before the third decade of life, with a really significant chunk of the bone density being accrued during the years surrounding peak height velocity, really emphasizing this close connection between longitudinal growth and bone acquisition. But due to that lag in bone density accrual, following longitudinal growth, there is this vulnerable period for fracture during the growing years when bone elongation outpaces bone deposition. This is particularly important from a long-term perspective, lifelong bone health, since bone density is one of these traits that tracks or remains relatively consistent, very consistent across the lifespan. So since bone density accrued during the formative years are contributing to peak bone mass attainment, this peak bone mass attainment is hypothesized to contribute to long-term risk for fracture and osteoporosis in adults. Now, this figure here, the schematic that I'm showing here, is one that I'm sure many of us have seen time and time again. It's depicting this theoretical concept of peak bone mass, where bone accrual is quite rapid during the childhood and adolescent years, reaches a peak the late teenage years, early 20s, and tapers off there on down the line. Now, peak bone mass attainment, ideally speaking, helps us reach this optimal threshold. So when the inevitable aging-related bone declines occur, we stay out of this danger zone here, depicted in red. Of course, it looks really ominous, where we have osteoporosis and fracture, which is most often thought of in aging, but can of course occur throughout the lifespan. Now, in instances where we have suboptimal, whether it be health status or lifestyle factors, environmental factors, chronic disease, pubertal delay, different therapeutics that might impact bone accrual or physical functionality, nutritional status, as well as physical activity, this can significantly compromise our ability to meet our optimal genetic potential in attaining peak bone mass, which might threaten long-term risk, or might increase long-term risk for osteoporosis and fracture, both in the short term as well as in the long term. Now, epidemiological data go as far as to suggest that a 10% increase in peak bone mass at the population level might help decrease risk for fracture by upwards of 50%. So really emphasizing the importance of optimizing bone accrual during the formative years to optimize our bank of bone density, if you will, as we go on with aging when bone loss is most common. Now, just to dive into these threats to bone health, and again, sort of with my background predominantly in childhood, adolescence, and the emerging adulthood years, we'll focus predominantly on peak bone mass attainment. I'll focus first on two relatively impactful position papers and workshop summaries that have been put out by really wonderful expert groups. The first one being from the Determinants of Peak Bone Mass workshop, which was held in 2015 at the NIH campus. I was actually really fortunate to have the opportunity to go to this workshop on the NIH campus in Maryland, and it was these are the life-changing experiences where you get to interact with really wonderful folks and brush elbows with top scientists and NIH representatives. So it was really inspiring to me, and has really led me on throughout my career here. But this workshop hit on a lot of really important topics with respect to attainment of peak bone mass, including genetics and endocrine regulation, tracking or consistency, again, of bone density during the formative years, and how that leads into adulthood, as well as in the context of osteoporosis and fracture risk, the effects of chronic disease and therapeutics on bone accrual and long-term fracture risk, as well as, of course, our behavioral lifestyle factors, including diet and physical activity. Along that same vein, diving into a second report that was commissioned by the National Osteoporosis Foundation to provide an updated summary of the relevant clinical data focusing on peak bone mass, which was originally published in 2000 by Dr. Robert Keeney, Connie Weaver, and a really wonderful team of researchers, including folks from the University of Georgia, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and really across the country, summarized the updated literature in terms of clinical data on behavioral factors and lifestyle factors impacting peak bone mass. Now, this paper actually has, I think, the scores have come out here recently that this is now one of Osteoporosis International's most cited articles, I think, in the top 10. So has had a really broad impact, obviously hitting on big picture topics such as determinants of peak bone mass. Now, this paper did a really nice job, not just in terms of summarizing the evidence that's mostly come out in the past 10 years preceding 2017, but also went through and provided a grade for each of these components that they went through and reviewed so rigorously. So as we might suspect from a nutritional and behavioral standpoint, some relatively obvious patterns emerge. There was strong data suggesting a favorable effect of calcium and vitamin D, dairy consumption, as well as physical activity, in particular, high impact physical activity. I know there are folks that are interested in the audience in terms of running on bone. So that's kind of actually where I started my research. And this has always been an interesting area to me, especially in the context of low energy availability, but high impact loading, of course, has a favorable effect, as well as strength training and aerobic training. However, there are severe deficiencies in the literature that that have been identified. So macronutrients, there's really not a wealth of data in terms of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Fats and proteins were reviewed in the article, but carbohydrates, due to the lack of data, were not. So carbohydrates representing really a significant chunk of the macronutrients that are consumed on a daily basis, as well as really with the emergence of the ketogenic diet and other carbohydrate restrictive dietary patterns that are now pervasive across really across the communities and populations. This is an important one likely to focus in on. That's in a very extreme situation of complete depletion or severe reductions, but nevertheless, an important topic to follow up on. Micronutrients, including sodium, potassium, most notably, especially with the emergence of chronic disease risk reduction, dietary guidelines that are now available for sodium and being considered for potassium, and how bone might be a relevant outcome of interest in further studying these chronic disease risk reduction recommendations. Dairy, interestingly enough, there has not been a great deal of data in terms of dairy feeding studies, well-controlled clinical studies, interventions, especially in the context of plant-based milks, these milk alternatives, which have grown in popularity. I'm guilty. I love my almond milk. I've kind of stayed away from dairy milk. So I always tell my students, don't, I guess you're not always practicing what you preach at times. So this is something that really is required because we really aren't sure about bioavailability of different minerals and micronutrients and macronutrients through these really popular food sources. Dietary fiber, fruits, vegetables, soft drinks. I know there are folks in the audience here that have significant interest in these topics, most notably dietary fiber, especially in the context of the microbiome. Of course, having been looked at in the context of calcium absorption, bone metabolism, and bone accrual during the growing years and in adulthood. Contraceptive use, Depo-Provera, oral contraceptives, some really unique data suggesting that if we can bypass hepatic metabolism, the growth hormone IGF-1 axis might not be as impacted. So the effects of oral contraceptives on bone might not be as pronounced, and really a lack of data in terms of LARCs on bone as well as in oral contraceptives. So overall, these two reports have identified several themes that are really deficient in the literature that could be very impactful in terms of bringing together clinical and translational researchers to hit on these critical needs, ranging from gene environment and gene environment interactions between the bone and other organs, muscle, fat, gut, brain, sexual dimorphisms, longitudinal studies during the growing years. And finally, many others that I won't get through here, but the use of high resolution imaging methodologies. So as we've transitioned now and started to understand the biological and behavioral factors contributing to peak bone mass, which is very much rooted in our traditional imaging methodology of dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, with the availability of more high resolution, sophisticated imaging methodologies, this concept and topic of peak bone strength has really emerged as an important topic to begin discussing and focusing in on. So from a methodological standpoint, how do we evaluate peak bone mass or even peak bone strength? There are several imaging methodologies that many of us likely use on a day-to-day basis, whether it be in research or clinical care. So from left to right, we have our DEXA scanner. In the middle, we have our PQCT scanner, which is peripheral quantitative computed tomography. And then on the right, we have our high resolution PQCT scanner. So just to start here with dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, typically DEXA is used. We might often think about DEXA from a clinical standpoint. This is the preferred method for clinical evaluations of bone density during childhood as well as in adults. Most often we're concerned about our hard tissue measurements, bone mineral content, areal bone mineral density, and depending upon the population of interest, really the age of the population or patient that we're studying, computing Z or T scores respectively for pediatrics and adults. DEXA also provides us with a really wonderful opportunity to evaluate soft tissue, lean body mass, fat mass at the whole body, as well as appendicular regions. And there's now updates in the DEXA system with both hologic as well as GE systems to evaluate more pathogenic fat depots, particularly that with respect to fat deposition in the abdominal cavity. So abdominal, subcutaneous, as well as visceral fat. The validity of these measurements does seem to be strong, but in childhood and adolescence has not been well vetted. So does require additional attention, but we have now published just recently a paper suggesting that abdominal visceral fat does in fact tell a little bit more about cardiovascular, long-term cardiovascular disease risk beyond our standard clinical measures such as BMI and waist circumference. From a kind of taking a left turn away from bone and body composition, but sort of still in the same vein, DEXA has also begun being applied for cardiovascular health assessment. So abdominal aortic calcification can be evaluated using more high resolution techniques, breast density, which is a strong predictor of breast cancer risk, as well as alternate methods of bone assessment, such as bone texture analyses, which is often referred to as the trabecular bone score, or TBS, which you might have seen in the scientific literature of the past I don't know, I guess 5 to 10 years as that methodology has been integrated into the field. Many strengths and limitations of DEXA, strengths including the wide availability and cost, low radiation exposure, and of course from a clinical and research standpoint, the availability of very robust reference ranges from across the lifespan. Limitations, however, include inter and intra scanner variability, as well as variability within and between operators and scan techs analyzing DEXA scans. Identifying optimal monitoring time intervals, as well as least significant changes from a standpoint within each individual lab. These test-retest reliability studies can be quite cumbersome and challenging. Going through and running those studies for each patient population coming through the lab to have specific least significant change values does get to be a bit of a clunky process, but it can be very important in identifying whether or not changes over time, one, were evaluated over a sufficient period of time, and two, whether or not those changes are suggestive of a biologically relevant change rather than changes that are just more or less measurement error. So a very important component of DEXA and really all bone imaging methodologies. Confounding of body size. So in the world of pediatrics, oftentimes we worry about shorter or stature in some instances. So stature related confounding, really due to methodological considerations due to DEXA's two-dimensional nature. So accounting for body size confounding, there are several methods that I can dive into after the presentation if we like, but I won't dive in too deeply with that. And then of course, DEXA is unable to distinguish between our cortical versus trabecular bone compartments, which can be very important when we're thinking about different therapeutics or chronic disease states that might preferentially impact the cortical and or trabecular bone compartments, which may not be detected from DEXA alone. Now, taking a step away from DEXA toward our more sophisticated imaging methodologies that are mostly relevant in the research setting, PQCT, which is often the abbreviation that's used, is a imaging modality that's used to evaluate peripheral appendicular cortical and trabecular bone geometry and macro structure and estimated strength. So you have the advantage of looking cross-sectionally at the bone in living human beings to evaluate bone macrostructure and using previously validated equations to estimate estimated compressive strength as well as bending strength. And you are able also to look at soft tissue at the appendicular regions, so muscle cross-sectional area at the forearm, at the lower leg. You can also evaluate the infiltration of fat within the muscle through proxy estimates of intermuscular fat, essentially the density of the tissue with respect to the fraction of fat versus muscle designated voxels. And similar approaches can be taken at the bone marrow as well to get an estimate of bone marrow fat accumulation. Now the DEXA scans look a bit different than we saw from, the PQCT scans look a bit different than a DEXA scans. On the left-hand side, we can see that these are measures of a cross-sectional area at the ultra-distal radius. So we can see, here's the radius right here. This red area is this trabecular bone compartment, and then we have a thin cortical shell on the outside. Here's our ulna, of course. Then on the right-hand side, we can see our radius, which is sort of this cylindrical bone, obviously, with a thick cortical compartment and a small little medullary cavity. No trabecular bone, of course, because this is more at a diaphysis region than, of course, the ulna on the left. So measurements that can be acquired at the trabecular site, ranging from volumetric density, total size, estimated compressive strength. And then from a cortical bone standpoint, the volumetric density of the bone, cortical bone thickness and area, the perimeter of the periosteum, the perimeter of the endosteum, which are the outer and inner borders of the cortex respectively, as well as validated estimates of bone strength. And of course, again, looking at soft tissue. So one of the nuances here that I did not bring up with respect to DEXA versus the PQCT, you are able to evaluate quote unquote BMD or bone mineral density. However, with the two-dimensional nature of the DEXA, this is an aerial bone mineral density or ABMD rather than a true volumetric mineral density or VBMD, since PQCT is a volumetric measurement you are able to evaluate, in a sense, the depth of the bone as well to estimate volumetric density here that you're just not able to with conventional DEXA methodologies. Now, taking a final step into high resolution PQCT, which I often sort of think about as a PQCT on steroids, if you will. Similar to the PQCT, you're able to evaluate cortical and trabecular bone compartments at the distal forearm, as well as the distal lower leg or the tibia, two often most often studied bones of interest. The PQCT is able to give you more mid-bone regions. The HR-PQCT is not able to evaluate those sites, unfortunately, but you can acquire measurements of cortical bone at the diaphysis with newer versions of the HR-PQCT scanner. Now, this device provides really wonderful high resolution images measuring in less than 58 micrometers. So really wonderful measurements that provide sort of, in essence, an in vivo bone biopsy, which it's often been referred to as. And there are data suggesting that metrics of bone microstructure and estimated strength from HR-PQCT are associated with increased risk for fracture independent of BMD from DEXA. So essentially, we're getting additional information from the HR-PQCT that DEXA is just not able to provide. From an image standpoint, here are a few representative images from a first-generation HR-PQCT scanner. So we can see that there's a significant difference in how these images look compared to a standard PQCT. You're able to actually make out the struts and beams that make up our individual and comprised cortical and trabecular bone compartment with our individual trabeculae, so we can evaluate, again, volumetric BMD, the number, thickness, separation, total density of our trabeculae, as well as utilizing finite element analysis methodologies, which are rooted in engineering in terms of identifying and estimating the strength of the bone with respect to compressive and bending forces. And then from a cortical bone standpoint, again, able to evaluate similar measures of the bone as we were able to with PQCT, but you're also able to utilize HR-PQCT to evaluate the micropores that accumulate in the cortical bone compartment, which have been associated with increased risk for fracture in a variety of patient populations, including type 2 diabetes in adults. Now, just to compare these methods against one another, from left to right, we have our DEXA PQCT and HR PQCT, where we're measuring areal density, macrostructure, and bone microstructure, respectively. Mostly DEXA is used both for clinical and research, but the latter two predominantly for research alone. And then again, this is very much related to the availability of robust reference curves. DEXA has very robust reference curves for pediatrics and adults alike. For PQCT and HR PQCT, these are otherwise limited. There are certain age ranges and groups, as well as devices that reference ranges are available, but challenges with harmonizing methodologies between centers as well as devices makes the use and application of these reference curves very challenged. So in practice, just to present some data here on a study that we published a couple of years ago in a cohort of children with Alagille syndrome, we utilized DEXA PQCT and HR PQCT imaging methods in a small cohort of children with Alagille syndrome, which is a complex condition, complex liver condition with a very severe phenotype impacting, from what it seems, essentially every organ system, from the eyes to the bones, to the liver, to the pancreas. Everything seems to be unfortunately impacted. So essentially what we did is we looked at DEXA and PQCT bone Z-scores. DEXA Z-scores computed using published reference ranges, PQCT Z-scores computed using local reference ranges at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And essentially we saw very wide variability in DEXA bone density that actually didn't seem to be suggestive of an average low bone density. Bone density Z-scores hovered around 0 with very wide variability, but on average was about 0. However, when we looked at our more discrete bone outcomes assessed via PQCT, we can see with trabecular and cortical bone outcomes, the average PQCT Z-scores ranged at about -2 standard deviations, suggesting that on average, children with Alagille syndrome tended to have lower cortical and trabecular bone traits compared to their healthy counterparts. When we looked at HRPQCT, since there are not available reference ranges, we used data from Stanford University. Mary Leonard's group graciously provided these data for us to use as a comparison. And the measurement of interest here is the separation of the trabeculae at the distal tibia. And basically what we saw was that children with Alagille syndrome tended to have a greater amount of separation between individual trabeculae, which would be suggestive of a detriment to trabecular bone microstructure in this patient population. So essentially what we're seeing here is that the DEXA does not necessarily reflect an altered or compromised bone phenotype in children with Alagille syndrome, but the PQCT and HRPQCT data paint a slightly different picture, a more concerning picture that just isn't detected with standard PQCT methods, or excuse me, standard DEXA methods. Now jumping into the CTSA. The CTSA, it's been a lot of fun actually reading into this. I joined back at UGA after completing my PhD here and postdocing at Purdue University, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and University of Pennsylvania, focusing on bone biology, childhood growth, and type 2 diabetes in youth. Jumping back here to UGA, being more mindful of the resources, expertise, and opportunities that exist, it's been really exciting to see. So this has actually been a lot of fun for me to see what wealth of expertise there is, which is phenomenal to me. But of course, the Georgia CTSA is represented by experts in a variety of different disciplines that likely have interest in the world of lifelong bone health and peak bone mass attainment, ranging from biomedical imaging, bioinformatics, of course, endocrinology, public health, and behavioral determinants of health, as well as our folks that study the omics, genomics, proteomics, metabolomics, and of course, many, many more. Many resources across the CTSA do exist, again, which has been very great for me to see. We can see that there's a lot of consistency across individual labs and core facilities that provide wonderful opportunities for collaboration and multi-site studies down the line. So the university, the Emory University Bionutrition Unit, the Morehouse School of Medicine Bionutrition Core, which I believe both have DEXA scanners. I'm not sure about the exact DEXA scanners, whether they're Hologic or GE models. Maybe some folks in the audience know the difference or know those specs and could provide that information. Although not a clinical lab, from my understanding, the Georgia Tech Microcomputed Tomography Core, which would be a really wonderful opportunity for collaboration, I think, from at least a technical standpoint, since the HRPQCT is really a micro CT, very similar, maybe 15, 20 times the size, but very similar methodologies. And then the UGA Clinical and Translational Research Unit, which my lab is a core facility and provide services on bone and body composition imaging. Now, in the Nutrition and Skeletal Health Lab, we do offer DEXA, PQCT, and thankfully Santa came early this year, and we finally were able to secure our Extreme CT2 HRPQCT scanner. So our HRPQCT was installed about a month ago, and we've now been going through very rigorous training with the folks from ScanCo. We have students and lab personnel now training on the methodology, which really sets the stage for very impactful scientific discovery down the line. There's, I believe, only 20 other research facilities in North America that have a state-of-the-art second-generation Extreme CT2 scanner, which provides a more detailed and accurate portrayal of bone microstructure and estimated strength than DEXA and PQCT, but also its predecessor, the Extreme CT scanner, due to the more clear and fine resolution that you're able to acquire from the second generation scanner. Of course, funding opportunities, and this is really where I'll wrap up. There are many funding opportunities obviously available. Funding is never easy to come by, of course, but funding agencies obviously and institutes from federal funding sources such as the NIH. So of course, off the top of the, right off the bat, we have NIAMS, which is obviously focused on studying causes, treatment, prevention of musculoskeletal, skin, and arthritis related disorders. have several requests for applications currently available in these areas of study, including clinical observational studies, exploratory clinical trials, as well as mechanistic ancillary studies to ongoing projects. So from R01 to R21 and R03, there are funding opportunities currently posted, at least through their page. The NICHD, which I'll focus on the pediatric growth and nutrition branch, obviously has a vested interest in understanding determinants and determinants of peak bone mass and peak bone strength, as well as lifelong threats to suboptimal bone health during the formative years, focusing on genetics of bone acquisition and linear growth, the effects of puberty, delayed puberty, most notably it seems, on bone acquisition, including endocrine factors that drive these processes, as well as the prevention and treatment and reversal of growth-threatening conditions. I'd be remiss not to get into non-federal funding sources, of course. I know that there's a great contingency of folks and experts at Emory, Children's of Atlanta, likely at Morehouse at UGA, studying cystic fibrosis and many complications of cystic fibrosis that occur across the lifespan. The cystic fibrosis has become an emerging topic in my research lab. We've been collaborating with a group at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, linking CF-related diabetes and CF-related bone disease in adolescents and young adults with CF, looking at the gut-bone axis, which has been incredibly intriguing, and from my understanding, funding opportunities available through the CF Foundation, notably in the world of endocrine dysfunction and CF-related bone disease, and of course, CF-related diabetes. This is, of course, even more timely now with the recent approval of Trikafta for children with CF. And then, of course, others, NIH, NIDDK, and American Diabetes. I've been fortunate to have success for research grants in the area of diabetes and the growing skeleton through postdoctoral fellowship awards that I received while at CHOP, the Department of Defense and USDA, our commodity groups such as National Dairy and egg boards, which are currently funding bone-related studies, and then our industry partners, which seem to be limitless, especially when we think about drug development. Now, just to wrap up with some final thoughts, I thought as I was reflecting on this presentation and different things to maybe get the ball rolling, this is my first time leading a discussion like this, so I thought it'd be wise to come in with some ideas, at least to get the conversation rolling. So as I've sort of thought through this, important research questions that could be immediately answered, or we could begin having conversations to begin answering down the line through the Georgia CTSA. One of the themes that emerges most is harmony of methodologies and research groups across the CTSA. We all have wonderful tools at our respective institutions. So harmonizing methodologies and devices between institutions would be very critical, especially as we think about multi-site studies within the CTSA as well as beyond. This really highlights the importance of reference curves, especially as we're thinking about studies in the growing years. Reference data really are lacking for PQCT as well as HRPQCT. So whether it be running longitudinal studies for construction of local reference curves, of course, for computing age, race, sex specific Z-scores and percentiles here just for use in the CTSA, or partnering with other institutions to try to tackle a bigger picture national reference curve project, of course, requiring very different funding amounts, but very critical needs, especially with these emerging technologies with different clinical populations. Technical aspects of scan acquisition and analysis. So from where do we set our reference lines for PQCT and HRPQCT measures? How do we make sure we're evaluating the same site of a moving target, basically a growing child or an adult that is losing bone across the lifespan? Effects of complex medical conditions. Of course, I brought up CF, Alagille syndrome, and others where you can all think of at your respective medical institutions. Training and education for students, providing really wonderful opportunities for hands-on learning opportunities here. We do have the value of maybe different opportunities for hands-on training for students and fellows here at UGA than at medical institutions where core facilities may have reluctance to allow folks to have a more hands-on approach for data collection and learning select methodologies. And then, of course, thinking through ideas for ongoing interaction. So throwing out ideas in terms of research affinity groups, pilot studies, symposiums focusing on this big picture topic of lifelong bone health, and of course, others. So just to wrap up, a couple of concluding remarks. There are obviously many unmet needs in the world of biological and behavioral threats to lifelong bone health. Of course, I hit on the topic of peak bone mass and peak bone strength, but many of these apply across the lifespan, obviously. Many from across the CTSA are currently tackling these really critical research questions. So coupled with the really wonderful opportunities in terms of resources and expertise from Atlanta to Athens, there really does present really wonderful opportunities for collaboration and synergy among groups and institutions to continue addressing these needs. So with that, I will conclude. I hope I didn't go on for too long, but yeah, thank you all for your attention. I think as we open this up, I guess, to conversation, I will maybe leave it to Kathy, but a couple of things to think about. I guess we already went through our introduction. I wasn't sure if we're going to do this.
I suggest to get going with the discussion because it's already 10 to 1.
Yep.
And this is taking away all our time.
Sure.
Okay, let's do it. Kathy?
Then let's take the slides down so we can see each other as we talk. Hopefully some of what you heard there resonated with you. What do you see are the areas where we can collaborate as a group? Roberto, do you want to start?
Yes, obviously there are many potential areas to collaboration. I think here at Emory, not the second generation HR PQCT is an essential machine. There's no hope to get any funding from NIH for human studies without that machine. So not having this at Emory, it's a grave limitation of our ability to compete successfully. Having this device in Athens is a great step forward, although we have to deal with the issue of having the patients going to Athens. So anybody recruited in Atlanta, that there will be a problem. Interest in peak bone mass acquisition, it's a very important area of research, but I have to say as a disclaimer that I probably live in a parallel world because nutrition has, and especially calcium, has been found to have a very, very limited role in that. It's an issue of genetic, heritable factors and estrogen. There is certainly possibility of further studies in the role of microbiome and other heritable factors that, along with genetics, contribute to peak mass acquisition. So the area of peak mass acquisition is a very good one, but we need to be very careful in not getting trapped in, I call it old research on calcium and other nutrients that at this point, I don't think will excite the NIH very much. And then of course, there is the enormous area of aging, skeletal involution, in elderly persons, with really unlimited possibility of translating into humans. A lot of work has been done in mice, including all the work on inflammaging and changes in immune system which occur with age. And I'll stop here.
Other thoughts and reactions?
Yeah, so Joe, first of all, welcome to our community. It's great to see the work that you're spearheading, and I think that nutrition is at the heart of a very specific direction for our research. I can let also the other Joe speak a little bit about it. In the future, I think the combination between translational research and clinical research, like the one that you're doing using nutraceuticals or functional foods, is gonna be a major area of potential collaboration, whether it's in skeletal health, as you presented today, or in repair, which we do a great deal of as well. And so perhaps getting you together with some of our traumatologists at Grady would be also another potential direction. The Agile work that you presented or alluded to is something that we have a very bright oral maxillofacial surgeon here that you probably need to also have some conversation with. His name is Steve Gowdy, and Steve has been working on JAG and Notch for some time. I think he has an R01, and an opportunity for you to talk would be useful. In terms of workshops, we have a musculoskeletal research workshop that I organize once a year. And so hopefully that would be an opportunity for us to learn more about the hardcore science that you're doing. So these would be first impressions based on what you presented today from my side.
I agree.
Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I agree. The Alagille syndrome one was an interesting opportunity. That was during my postdoc. I was in GI hepatology and nutrition, had the chance to work with David Piccoli, Kathy Looms, and they actually might be collaborating with this group in Emory on some Alagille syndrome work, if I recall. But it is a very interesting bone phenotype that emerges, especially as we're thinking about these alternate imaging approaches. And it really does hark back to Roberto's comments there with heritability and the role of genetics, because that is a critical component here. And I think those position statements do hit on that quite nicely, of needing to understand the heritability as well as the interactions with lifestyle factors, which really haven't been done beyond DEXA phenotyping, especially during the growing years, because these longitudinal bone traits are really critical to look at during pediatrics, because the genetic it seems like the genetic fingerprint looks a little bit different than we're considering cross-sectional data. So that obviously takes quite a bit of time, money, and effort. So definitely an area that I'd be interested in diving into if folks would want to continue talking.
Roberta, I was wondering, I know Roberta is interested in the role of microbiome in bone health, and the microbiome is greatly affected by diet. So I was just wondering if there's an area of intersection there.
Yes, that's a good observation. The point is the variation within a Western diet at the end of the day have a little consequence on the microbiome. The big differences are on major diet difference. So if you compare the diet of an African country to a Western country, you're going to find big difference in microbiome composition, and thus the skeleton. But this is certainly the intersection of how diet modify the microbiome and how the microbiome represents one of the heritable factors that contributes to bone mass acquisition is an important one. We have a starting point. We published this year a study showing that the microbiome contributes to, we call it postnatal skeletal acquisition. So how high bone density gets into a mouse is controlled by the microbiome. Another area that I think is very critical, and it could be an opportunity, is transgender medicine and skeletal acquisition. So, the transgender persons are an interesting experiment model, so to speak. Sorry, I don't want to sound rude, but you have the genetic environment opposite of the hormonal effect on bone, and how much the skeletal development is due to the genetic and how much to the hormonal environment is not clear, needs to be determined. And then interestingly, there is a sexual dimorphism in microbiome. So microbiome in men and women is different. So that's a third player that comes to, you know, to act in transgender people. So there are plenty of funding opportunity these days for transgender medicine, and see what happens to transgender patients that are subjected to hormonal treatment in terms of skeleton acquisition, because many of them begin hormonal therapy at puberty. It would be very interesting. But again, hormones, microbiome, and skeletal acquisition, I think is a worthwhile area of investigation.
Roberto, do you mind if I follow up on a comment that you made previously? I think in our previous conversations over the past year, I think it's nice to put a face to an email address to tell you.
Likewise.
Yeah. So, you know, with having now the second generation HRPQCT scanner here in Athens, one of my, you know, ultimate long-term hope is to start building bridges and really opportunities for this collaborative effort, reducing the need to really reinvent the wheel in terms of securing this incredibly expensive device, maintaining overhead at each institution. What would you foresee as challenges, barriers, obviously beyond just the geography of Athens versus Atlanta, that might impede or actually promote opportunities for collaboration utilizing the resources that are available?
Well, I think if you have the machine and if you have trained personnel, you are in a wonderful position. If it were up to me, I would put the machine in a mobile van and move it across, because sending patients to Athens and vice versa, it's problematic. And I don't have the experience on how to get around that, but it's, you know, obviously enrollment and subsequent visit would be very difficult. But the machine is fantastic. I want to emphasize for the group that in study section, don't even try to propose a clinical study with an alternative machine, because it just won't fly in 2021.
Well, I've looked at the RV costs as well. I think it might be outside my budget right now, but that's something I can look at.
Maybe we need to do a bake sale or something to raise some money for your RV.
Bake sale would cover it, I think, yeah.
No, but what it could be done, in reality, the machine has two components. There's the scanner in itself, and then has all the computers. So it wouldn't be crazy to duplicate the scanner and put one in the imaging center on the HSRB2 at Emory, and having a centralized analysis unit with trained personnel. What we don't need is to have twice the personnel and twice the computers. I don't think what the cost would be, but it's not crazy.
Right, and we were fortunate. COVID has obviously been incredibly challenging for a lot of different reasons. We have to work hard to find silver linings. One of the silver linings was that Scanco had a tremendous surplus in devices that were coming off of contract with drug development companies that have had to pull clinical efforts in those drugs. So they had contracts, leasing agreements terminate, and a surplus of scanners on their hands. So we were able to purchase our device, which maybe had been used for, I don't know, scanning 10 patients before over the past 2 years, at a significant discount. And it's now covered on service contract and factory warranty for the next 3 years. So the cost of running scans, it's going to be predominantly man hours for acquisition and analysis, but I think we're in a really wonderful time for running pilot studies in a really cost-efficient manner, at least for the foreseeable future here, using that device.
Yeah, but just to emphasize, so I know, for example, now many grant application, including the budget, the cost of leasing them, such instrument, the study section usually approve it because there is really no alternative. So there are many machines that are leased for 3-4 years for the duration of the study, and then they are returned to Scanco. So there could be an opportunity of purchasing the scanner in itself without having to buy more computers.
Certainly sounds like something you should bring up with Dr. Stevens.
I did, and he said, well, when we open the imaging center at the new HSRB, there would be the place and the opportunity. So
I think
that means now.
Keep reminding him, I think.
Yeah.
Joe, what's your ability to recruit patients there in Athens? I'm not familiar with the situation that you have there as far as doing clinical recruitment.
Yeah, when you say recruitment for patients, healthy folks or clinical populations? Either.
Both.
Yeah, so I am lucky to have done my PhD here at UGA, so I did a lot of recruitment of healthy individuals. Our work that we're doing right now is in the adolescent to adult transition. So Athens, fortunately, has a wide population of folks in that age range of 16 to 30 years. So the challenge ends up residing in, are you getting an equitable distribution of the population and not just focusing on UGA students who are likely a very different type of, adolescent to adult, young adult than their counterparts that may not be at the social, that may not have the same social advantages or other types of advantages. So there are challenges there, but of course the healthy folks for studies, that's going to be our bread and butter. The challenge of the last year, I started my appointment here in 2020, August 2020. So I was not allowed to bring folks into the lab for basically my first year due to COVID restrictions. So we're just now, we are going through and getting our first IRB protocol through to test pilot data or collect pilot data and feasibility of the HRPTCT and our new DEXA scanner in the lab here. So I think that'll be our first approach. So if you have ideas or if you have ideas for recruitment of both healthies as well as clinical populations, of course, I'm all ears. I'm always interested in learning more and hearing about other resources.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of putting in applications that might, at least initially, involve mechanistic animal studies being done here at Emory with tools that we have, and possibly having a clinical arm that you guys could be involved with. And as Roberto said, we can't really recruit here and send them to Athens, but I was curious as to whether or not we could potentially have the recruitment happening there in the Athens area, depending on what disease population we might be interested in.
Right, and I do recognize that some folks may have maybe their primary clinic is based out of Atlanta or surrounding neighborhoods, but also may come out to Athens or across the state for other clinics, maybe once or twice a month or whatever. So maybe there are patients that are geographically, convenient to Athens, but I think that would obviously require a lot more attention to bring in different clinicians to see where patients are currently living, how close they would be for different clinical studies.
Do you think that you could do this by offering transportation? So I'm thinking the CTSA has a van.
I thought exactly that same point, Kathy. So some sort of charter, there are vehicles and whatnot available through the institution that you'd be able to utilize. That's a pretty significant distance to pay for Uber rides or Lyft rides. So I think having something like that could be potentially of value. And in all seriousness, Roberto's comment about outfitting the device in an RV was something that I looked into quite seriously. I think the challenges ends up being suspension and shock absorption.
Okay, DEXA machine are placed in.
They are. I think there ends up being challenges. I've tried to I think talking with folks from NHANES, I think would be very valuable in that way with their mechs having had DEXA scanners. There are some companies with mobile units in the Alabama area. So not too far away with DEXAs, but I don't think a HR has been put in an RV before, but that's not to say it can't be done, right?
I mean, there are mobile clinical
Yep.
CTs and clinical MRIs.
I'm terribly
I mean, they go
sorry.
in 18
I
meters,
need
but
to go that, otherwise they're gonna shoot me at the clinic, so apologize for this, but out of my control.
Thank you for being here,
to,
Roberto.
sure, looking forward to continue conversation.
Sir, take care.
Bye now.
yeah, I don't know if that's cost feasible. I mean, it probably cost more than the scanner to have a vehicle that could haul it around. And I would also be a little bit curious about the durability of that. It's a pretty sensitive machine. So, you know, bouncing around the road.
Right.
Let's hear from some others who have interest here. What do you hear that people say? What areas do you